All right, we're back here on Sportsline. The sports world obviously has been turned upside down over the last several weeks because of the coronavirus and the outbreak worldwide. The NBA season postponed immediately when a player tested positive for COVID-19, and we just saw the trickle effect. College basketball canceling all their conference tournaments, and then the NCAA tournament. You saw other professional sports leagues suspend their play at that time, and now even today you see Wimbledon canceling what it was planned for the championships this summer in July over in London. And so you just have this constant stream of effects based off of what is going on right now as first and foremost the most important thing. The world, the U.S. and the world at large, tries to battle this virus and get it under wraps so we can get back to normal life. Amazingly enough, something similar to this in the sports world has happened before. You go back more than a century to 1919, the Spanish flu, and there's a book written about that. It's called 1919, The Search for Mankind's Greatest Killer by Ken Rosen, and the author, Ken Rosen, joins us now here on Sportsline. Ken, good evening. Hope you're safe. Thanks for coming on with us.
I am. Hope you guys are safe as well. Thank you for having me, Steve.
Well, let's just start with the book and kind of the general premise, how you got into writing it first and foremost, and then sort of where you took the project.
So I was introduced to the story when I was working for the National Hockey League. I spent a lot of time down in Nashville when the Predators launched, working with the club. And about 15 years ago, we were prepping our Stanley Cup playoff campaign and marketing campaign, and I stumbled upon the story just by reading this guide and record book that said in 1919, the Stanley Cup was not handed out. And it fascinated me that no one in this room at the NHL knew why. So I started to research it and came upon the story about a lot of similarities to what's going on now. The biggest difference is obviously that we're in a different technological age, medical age, and science age right now. But the similarities are striking to what you see unfolding with the coronavirus at the present time.
So the book you wrote, is it a true story? It reads more like a story from what I gather than sort of a history book or a history text to what happened in 1919. Is it all based off of a true story? Is it true characters involved? Or did you take some liberties to what happened?
A little bit of yes is the answer. How's that?
There we go.
I think we've all read enough school books. So what I wanted to do is write a novel. It's a story. I'm a storyteller by trade. So the book is based on real events and real people that played in the NHL back in the turn of the last century. The Montreal Canadiens were the team that I focused on because they were the team that got sick and couldn't put a team on the ice for the 1919 Stanley Cup Finals. That finals, similar to what happened with golf a couple weeks ago, was canceled near the end. They had one game to go. Montreal couldn't put a team on the ice, so the game was canceled. So then I take the reader through the next 70, 80, 90 years up until the beginning of this century, the 21st century, with a bunch of quirky but brilliant scientists who were trying to figure out what happened in 1918 and 1919. The census obviously wasn't as good as it is today. So reports are that anywhere between 20 million and 200 million people worldwide perished from what was called, to your point, the Spanish influenza, but actually was a bird flu. It was an avian flu, H5N1, that started coming around about 10 years ago. So it's based on true people, real events, and to your point, I took a little bit of creative license.
Hey, that's totally okay. We're talking with Ken Rosen, the author of the book 1919, The Search for Mankind's Greatest Killer. Ken, when you were researching this and you looked back at 1919 and the story of that Stanley Cup final, what was the public's reaction to what was going on then? Because obviously you don't have the social media influence, you don't have the media influence that you have in such proliferation today. How did they handle, the biggest thing in Canada getting canceled in the Stanley Cup final and everything else that went with that?
Well, just to set the scene for you, Montreal were the champions of the National Hockey League, the NHL, which was in its infancy. The Stanley Cup was launched in 1892, and that year it was decided that the Montreal Canadiens would play the champion of the Pacific Coast Hockey League, the PCHL, which happened to be the Seattle Metropolitans. So to set the scene for you, it took Montreal over a week by train to travel out to Seattle. All the games were held in Seattle just because they couldn't afford to go back and forth and lose all that time. Like you said, no internet, phones barely operable. Film was just about a decade old. So it was radio, telegraph, and that was just about it. So to answer your question from the medical side, from 1918, when the influenza broke out in 1918, the scientists really didn't know what they were battling, and word did not travel that great. So the infection just blew up all over the world. People dying, there's stories, 600,000 people in the U.S. died, and there was only 150 million people, in the U.S. at that time. So it was a terrible tragedy, but the scientists at the time, the medical society, didn't have microscopes powerful enough to see what they were fighting. They had never seen a virus before. So after a while, they finally figured out, it took them months to figure out, that it was airborne, it was passed from person to person, and they started doing a lot of the things after about 8 or 10 months, as far as what we're doing right now is basically shutting down society. But it took them a lot longer just because of the period that they lived in.
What was the result on other sports at the time? The Stanley Cup final obviously was canceled because of a team having an outbreak within it, that Montreal team. But what happened to sports in general over that year or so?
Sports at the time weren't as organized and as popular. Hockey was very popular, obviously, because it was probably it was around the longest at that point. So hockey was more popular, I would say, than today, because it was organized. They were marketing and promoting. There are pictures in the summer and fall of 1919, when the flu came back again for the third time, where baseball teams are still playing, but every player on the field's got a mask on, every umpire, everybody in the crowd's got a mask on. Wow. And there's pictures of people at golf events doing the same thing, with everyone's got masks on. So they figured that out pretty quickly, and they were able to manufacture that like we are doing right now. But sports did go on, mainly because it took them so long to shut down all of society. They wanted to keep sports going as long as possible, to kind of distract and offer people who were really suffering at the time a distraction and a little bit of form of entertainment. So sports did go on. It didn't shut down completely like we're doing now, which, in my opinion, is the right move. You
mentioned all the differences in technology and certainly medicine over the course of the century between 1919 and now. When you were researching and then writing this book and going through all the history of what happened then, did you ever imagine you would live to see a similar time?
No. And, the science is pretty accurate. And when you could go back and look through medical history, these things happen about once every 100 years, which we're right there. But, dating back to like the 1350s, which was the Black Plague, bubonic plague that killed hundreds of millions of people in Europe, these outbreaks happen about every 100 years. So while I was writing this, which I started about 15 years ago, I could see that, we're coming up to that point where something, we're due. And I never thought I would live through it. I thought maybe my kids and my grandchildren would have to deal with it again. But it's pretty amazing to see what was prelude is now happening again.
Yeah, it is crazy. Ken Rosen is with us, the author of the book 1919, The Search for Mankind's Greatest Killer. Given the way we've reacted, obviously much different, much harsher, much more quickly than anything they even knew to do back then. I know you're not a medical expert, but what do you think is likely to happen in terms of sports over the next several months?
I think they're going to be very cautious. I've worked at the NHL, I've worked at the NBA, I've worked for other leagues and other teams. I think they're going to be very cautious because they're very cognizant of their fans and their athletes, obviously, and they want to be ultra careful. So, having said that, I'm an optimist. I believe that I'm hoping that in the next couple of weeks this will peak. The curve will start trending back down, like the scientists are talking about. And I think we'll start to see light at the end of the tunnel. So, I know people are talking about, 3 months, 6 months, the summer. I heard something the other day about like sacrifice now and save the football season,
Right.
which is so American, right? But I think being an optimist and knowing the subject matter pretty well and following it. I'm a news junkie as well, following it on TV and following all these briefings that they do from the White House. You have to stay optimistic. And I think as long as we're optimistic and we're doing what we're asked to do, which is stay home, keep that social distancing, the flu won't have an opportunity to transfer from human to human and continue on its deadly course.
Yeah, my intro to the show tonight, Ken, was basically my optimism of this, that we have a lot of really smart people working on this, and it's hard for me to imagine that the doctors and the scientists that are doing this aren't going to come up with something that allows us to get back to normal in the next, I don't know if it's weeks or a month or so, but the people who start talking about 2021 and things like that, that's far-fetched for me right now, and I think you have to keep that optimism because, frankly, if you don't, it's hard to move on a day-to-day basis because you have such a tie to the leagues. There have been a lot of talks of what it's like, and I'm sure you're right, they're going to be cautious. But do you think it's likely, NBA, NHL, they would love to get this season done. If they come back, do you think we come back in empty arenas? Do you think they come back with some sort of truncated season? What do you think is likely with those sports in particular if they come back sometime later this spring or summer?
Well, the NHL, I experienced the lockout season of 2004, 2005, and a couple of lockouts and issues before and after that. So they have done the NHL has done truncated seasons before. I don't think that anyone wants to come back to empty buildings, and I think that once you start to see the curve go down, and the feeling is that okay, we're kind of coming out of this. Hopefully in about a month, 6 weeks maybe. I think the leagues will look at the remainder of the season, what they can play, and figure out how best. The biggest thing that they want to do is they want to get a playoff season in, and they want to hand out the championship trophy. The amazing thing to me is, and this, Steve, the NCAA shutting down, you talk about the NHL, the NBA, baseball, you're talking about like tens of billions of dollars for not only the economy, but that's what these leagues do. They drive all different kinds of businesses. Everything's shut down. And I think not only would it be financially smart to restart this at some point as soon as they can with fans in the stands, but it would be fiscally and emotionally smart. You got to get the country back to feeling where we're coming out of this. We're going to be all right, just like it happened in 1919. Quick story for you, if I can. Yeah. When I was a kid, and I use this I use my experience in the book. My grandparents lived outside of Birmingham in a place called Mountain Brook, Alabama, and we would go see. I spent every summer with them, and we would go see the fireworks on top Red Mountain every year. And as a kid, I happened to look across the street one time, and looking into the woods, I could see that there were headstones there, and it was the most unkept cemetery I'd ever seen. And I remember as a kid turning to my grandpa and saying, why did they let this cemetery get so overgrown? It's sad for the people that are buried there. And he told me that cemetery was from 1919, and the time period was so difficult and so deadly that after they buried the people in that cemetery, everyone was afraid to go back in because they thought they'd get the influenza and die. That's how bad the time was. So when that influenza ended, people got back to life very quickly, and no one wanted to talk about it. They basically buried that portion of their history, their lives, and rarely talked about it. If you look at school books, it's usually about one paragraph in the history books of growing up of the Spanish influenza, which is improperly named. It was a worldwide avian flu that broke out at the same time. So I guess what I'm saying is that it was such a bad time, but society did come back, and there was hope. And it came back because we've been living a very happy and successful as society for the past 9,500 years since that time. So we will come back, but I think we need those things that we love, things that we rely on, things that give us a reason to cheer, be happy, be social. I want to cheer my team with my buddies and yell at my friends who like other teams as much as everybody else. I think that the NHL and the NBA will do it at the right time with fans and give us something to kind of break out of this this deadly time that we're in that we all have to be careful about.
Yeah, it's really kind of a malaise for a lot of people at home. Ken, when you were researching the book, what was the response when hockey came back in Canada, when sports came back from whatever hiatus in general? And what do you think it will be like when that first game is played, or when that new season starts, or the hockey playoffs resume in this country or on this continent?
You know, I guess the biggest experience that most of us who were around 19 years ago, we can relate it to 9/11. And the first game that the NHL played in after the attacks of 9/11 was a Ranger game, and we went there and we had multiple crews, and we were in the building shooting, and there were flags, and people were shaking hands with firemen and policemen. There was just a unity in the country, and everyone brought it back together, right? I think the feeling is going to be very similar to that, but a little bit more cautious, because unlike those attacks, even though we didn't know that they were over at that point, there was a sense of security that our government and our defense and our military is going to protect us. This is not going to happen again. We can't be that confident with a virus, something that we can't see, that can transfer itself and flame up again. So we still have to be careful. I think there'll be a lot of passion in the buildings. There'll be a lot of happiness for the fans, for the fans and the players. There might be some social distancing in the buildings, but I think you'll see a lot of emotion both inside and outside of the building when these sports come back. And I think related to the book as well, if you're a sports fan, you're really going to enjoy the book, because you're seeing what happened 100 years ago through the eyes of these athletes. And so if you're sports fans, if you're a sports fan, you'll appreciate that part, the athletic perspective of what these athletes were going through and how it basically shut down their season. And actually, one of the players from Montreal, Joe Hall, passes out on the ice in the last game, goes to hospital, and never leaves it. He died 2 days later. But the rest of the book, the science and the medicine, it's like I said, it's not a school book. It's a novel. It's a story, and it's very relevant to what's going on right now. And I think people who read it will learn a lot more than they know now, and will enjoy it, because it's an entertaining learning. It's not a school book type read.
Well, it's certainly pertinent to what we're all going through right now. Ken Rosen is the author. The book is 1919, The Search for Mankind's Greatest Killer. It is available at Amazon, Apple Books, and Barnes & Noble. Ken, we appreciate your time tonight. Anything else you want to pass along to the folks at home about the book?
No, just about the book, buy it, read it, and get back to me. Tell me if you like it. How's that?
Yeah, that's good. I can't wait to read it myself. Ken, stay safe. I hope to see you in a hockey rink soon.
Hope to see you at the Preds game, Steve. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Ken Rosen, the author of the book, again, 1919, The Search for Mankind's Greatest Killer. It is really amazing to think that we are dealing with this once again, but that is a great historical and entertaining look, as he says, about what went on back then with that bird flu around the globe, and certainly impacting the Stanley Cup final. And now we fast forward a century later, and we're dealing with this coronavirus that has impacted everything in sports and, frankly, everything worldwide. That includes the Olympics. Olympics postponed from this year to next year. Up next, we chat with a local athlete, Joe Fry, about what his schedule looks like now that the Olympics have been postponed.